We are Pro Cannabis Media.
I'm live now, okay? So we're back, and we'll wait for David to get his microphone on.
He's got his microphone
the right spot.
on.
Okay, fair enough. Welcome back
We're
to the second hour of Cannabis Chat. I'm Jimmy Young, along with David Rabinowitz in studio, and we have two other great guests coming your way. In fact, we'll be joined a little bit later in this half hour by Stu Zakim. But right now we have Rob Mejia. He is a instructor at Stockton University and also a curriculum person who builds out online courses for cannabis and at our community harvest. Rob Mejia, good to see you, and thank you again for joining us.
Always a pleasure to talk to you, Jimmy, and wow, what a week.
Yeah, what a week. And of course, also joining us is Bruce Barcott, the editor of Leafly and the author of Weed the People. Bruce, again, thank you so much for joining us.
Hey, Jimmy, good to be back with you.
All right, and what a week. 5 for 5, guys. You know, that's a great percentage. That'll get you in the Hall of Fame. And it sure was easier to pass marijuana policy bills than it was to get a new president in place, let's just say. A lot quicker results and obviously a clean sweep. I'm going to go to Bruce first, Rob, if you don't mind. I want to get his impressions on the fact that these 5 states all came on board, 4 as legal adult use, and there really wasn't any drama.
Yeah, the drama, if anything, was in the disparity between the polls going into the election and the actual result. I mean, you know, a few elections ago, a lot of us worked with the rule of thumb that you needed a good 5 percentage point buffer in polls going into an election. Like, you know, you wanted 55% support or above in order to have a chance to pass these legalization measures, because the thought was a lot of people would balk at the last minute. They'd be scared of the change. And that rule of thumb has kind of disappeared. I mean, we saw going in, you know, I think approval ratings in New Jersey in maybe the mid 60s, and the final result was 67% approval. We saw South Dakota was like, man, that was under 50% support going into the election for adult use, and to come out with 53% voting for recreational legalization in South Dakota, that was a head spinner for me. I expected South Dakota to pass medical, but then come up to like 48% on adult use. So that was a real pleasant surprise for me. And then Mississippi approving medical, not just by 74%, but going for the actual real medical measure, and not the kind of fake one that the legislature tried to put up. That was a really nice reassurance that voters actually read these things and take them seriously.
Absolutely, and it was John Boehner, the former House Speaker's quote that I love. He goes, "When cannabis is on the ballot, it wins. Even with hyper-partisanship everywhere else, people of all stripes agree about cannabis reform." Rob, you're in New Jersey. You're a native there now. How pumped is everybody in New Jersey?
We are very excited, but at the same time, as Bruce alluded to, all the polls kept saying that we were going to be going above 60%. We had a poll from Monmouth, we had one from Stockton, I saw another one, and they all were between about 61, 62% up to 68%. I thought that might go down a little bit because the ballot measure was actually on the back of the ballot, and it was in very, very small font, so I thought a few people might miss that. In our class, we actually did an exercise where we looked at all the legislation, and we went through and made our predictions on what was going to pass. And I did predict that all the measures were going to pass, and I had South Dakota and Montana squeaking by at like 50.2% and 50.5% respectively. But I thought we were going to run the board. And I was not surprised at all that the medical legislation went through so quickly, because if you look on a national level, if you ask somebody medically, if your doctor says you should be considering cannabis, you get responses in the 80 percentile range, sometimes even 90% that say, sure, if my doctor says it, we should consider it and allow it.
Right, and by the way, the pollsters have been taking a beating the whole week, let's just say, on a few other fronts. And speaking of that front, since you guys have been connected over the last hour, I'm not sure if anything has changed in the presidential race. I keep waiting to hear something that might change. Nothing has changed. So it feels like I'm in a suspended animation over the last 3 or 4 days. There hasn't been a lot of movement, right?
Yeah, there's been movement, but
Little.
how do you see what's going on with the election influencing national cannabis policy?
Bruce, you go first.
Oh man. Here's my. Let's say that Biden continues to gain votes and he wins the presidency. If that's the case, I'm really sincerely looking forward to putting his feet to the fire for 4 years on cannabis policy. This is a president, elect, if that's the case, who, comes from a generation where he truly was one of the leading drug warriors of the 90s. We know that. He's admitted that. And he has, he has some making up to do on that front. He doesn't like legalization. I think he can understand it. I think Kamala Harris will help him come along on that front. It's looking like he's going to run into a Senate still led by Mitch McConnell, who cannot stand anything having to do with legalization. So my answer to this, look, one of my answers to this is let's legalize in Kentucky in 2022. Get it right in Mitch's backyard. That seems to change the minds of senators,
Sure. Or why don't we just stop all the hemp legislation, since there's so many hemp farmers in Kentucky, and tell them until we bring both sides up to parity, the low THC and the high THC, you don't get anything.
Interesting.
I thought one.
What do you think?
I thought one interesting point that one of my students made about Montana is that Montana has a very vibrant hemp industry. They actually have twice as many acres of hemp planted as any other state.
Wow.
And they kind of came out of nowhere. If you looked at the stats 3 years ago, they weren't even on the list of the top 5, 6, 7, 8. And then all of a sudden, here they are producing twice as much as Colorado and twice as much as Kentucky. And so one of my students said, maybe that was part of the reason or something that lends itself towards getting people past a little bit of the stigma that they know somebody who's now in the hemp industry and they know that hemp leads to CBD. I mean, that's always kind of that's the baby path that leads people to kind of look a little bit at acceptance. And so who knows, maybe the hemp industry actually did help to kind of soften up the voters a little bit. And perhaps that could happen in Kentucky as well. And like Bruce, I am looking very forward to seeing Harris use her influence because she was the main sponsor behind the MORE Act. And let's see if she can move him along. I think she will, and definitely the Democrats will be more favorable towards cannabis legislation than the Republicans.
At the top of the show, we talked to Morgan Fox from the NCIA out of Washington, D.C., and we talked about that whole premise of lobbying in Washington, D.C. in what has really been a difficult time. Let's all face it, guys. And Bruce, you brought up the fact about the assumed president-elect Joe Biden. I think that might be a good way to look at it. The assumed president-elect at this point. I don't know.
Candidate Biden. How about we go with that?
All right. But they have both moved off where they were years ago. You brought up where he was in the 90s. I get it. Kamala Harris, as the Attorney General in California, has certainly changed her tune as well. Bruce, you understand that it's more of a civil rights issue now than a drug issue. I guess where I'm going with this is the argument is becoming stronger and stronger. And how can it be aligned and tied to jobs, banking, and COVID relief? To me, everything's aligned properly, even without a Democrat-controlled Senate. It does still seem to me that there is ways to convince those congressmen and legislators that we can actually move forward on this, because the whole public, what is it, 63% now favor legalization nationally, Bruce? Is that the latest one?
Yeah, it is. It's about 65%, and there's word that it's looking like there will be a new poll coming out on Monday with even potentially stronger results. So it's really exciting. I think here's one thing that has led me to believe that it really that state by state efforts help the national effort. No questions asked, is that I see it with my own congressman. My member of Congress here in Washington State is Derek Kilmer. And sometimes I feel like he's never actually met anyone who works in the cannabis industry. I mean, I've called his office a number of times, tried to reach out to him. And I'm saying, why are you not a co-sponsor of the MORE Act? Why are you not a co-sponsor of this bill or that bill? Like, you may not know it, but there are hundreds and possibly thousands of your constituents have full-time jobs in this industry. We're supporting our families with this. We're good law-abiding, tax-paying citizens. And yet I feel like you're still scared by the stigma of this, and it's time to get over that. And I'm one of the reasons. And I did not donate any money to Derek Kilmer. I voted for his primary opponent this spring, specifically because of this issue. And, I kind of held my nose and voted for him in November because his opponent was no better. But these politicians, these members of Congress, need to meet people in the industry. And these lobbying days on DC, they actually do make a difference.
Rob, what's your take on where you think the national scene will go, and in the trenches in Washington D.C.?
Would you rephrase that question?
So, how do you think the sales job is going to be as we move forward to implementing what the assumed nominee, president-elect, whatever we want to call Joe Biden at this point, and what happens over the next few months? How quickly can we move to their implementation of decriminalization, descheduling it, and can we continue to take the momentum of the green wave, if you will, to Washington? And what do you think is going to happen down there?
I think the trends will still continue, that it will be largely state and region led. And so with New Jersey going, people keep talking about the domino effect. And certainly we're already seeing that. We're seeing a lot of chatter from New York that Cuomo says legislatively, let's get in there, let's get this done, let's try to do it within about a year. You see Pennsylvania doing the same thing, Connecticut, and it's because we are so interconnected. We're in the tri-state area, and right now New Jersey has a population of about 9 million. Within 2 hours, 25 million people can get here. And so you're going to see a lot of people who will come here for legal adult use where they can't get it in their own state. That's certainly going to push the other states to go, and it will also push the whole social equity argument. You'll see a lot of jobs being created. Just today in New Jersey, they announced the head of the Cannabis Commission. And interestingly enough, Phil Murphy picked Diane Hoyu. She is part of ACLU, and she has been an advocate for a long time, and she always talks about social justice. And so she said, as part of the commission in New Jersey, she's looking at what she calls twin values, equity and integrity. And she said, there's no way that we can progress without having both of those items available. And so they're looking to put in an equitable and a program with integrity. So I think as you see New Jersey start to really embrace social justice and put that in the legislation, which we fully expect to see, there was some of that before, but I think we're going to see even more of that now. There's about 200 pages of legislation that is waiting to be submitted, and it'll be submitted as early as tomorrow, but probably next week. And I bet there'll be a lot of provisions for micro licenses, economic incentive areas. There may be incubation programs with the government. I am very excited to see what we'll do. That is also going to push the other states around us to do some of the same things. And as states around us get social justice right or come up with innovation like that, you're going to see other states embrace it. So I think I'm seeing a regional, sort of like a little bleed. So you start with Jersey, we'll go to the tri-state area, we'll move. You saw what happened with Illinois. So it's just going to keep spreading like that. And I think that will happen before any kind of total national legalization that says, yeah, we can all do it. You'll still have a few holdouts, I think, in like Wyoming and Idaho and places like that. That'll be a little more difficult to convince.
Well,
Yeah.
another New Jersey resident has just joined our little forum here on Cannabis Chat, Stuart Zakim from the Bridge Strategic Group, a guy who's kind of well known here in the area, a legendary family in the Boston area. I think I can say that, Stuart. Good to see you, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy, and thanks for your work on the revising Team Harmony.
Yeah, I appreciate
that. Should be pretty exciting.
Yeah, no, it was. It was great. What's your impressions of what happened in New Jersey, and where do you think, and when do you think you'll see New York actually implemented through their legislature?
Well, first of all, I'm thrilled. It's probably the best news that came out of this election until we get a resolution of who's president. But after a long, long fight, the legislative body couldn't make it happen last year. Jersey politics, more than argument about yes or no for legalization. And by putting it on the ballot, obviously they passed the buck to the public. And I must say, I was a little nervous coming up to Election Day as to whether or not it would pass, in spite of the polls, because once again, we see how inaccurate polls are. There was very little awareness outside of the cannabis community. And that's largely due, there was no money spent on, people, a couple $1 million, but that's not real money in any kind of political campaign. And the fact that the ballot initiative itself was on the back of the ballot only heightened my fears. And there was a lobbying group that came up with a hashtag turn the page, which hopefully was effective because the vote was won by such a wide margin. Of course, like in Massachusetts, Jimmy, every town has an option to let adult use dispensary in their town or not. To what Rob was saying earlier, it's not going to be the kind of blackmail that's gone on in Massachusetts from the towns, where they're asking for a lot of money in addition to all the other stuff. And additionally, our tax is going to top out at about 8%. Which, you talk about equity, and I've worked with Diana for a long time. I'm thrilled at Murphy's Choice. I've been slugging it out here for 7 years now, and Diana was always so crucial to the not only ACLU but to the idea as a whole. And he couldn't have made a better choice. Where do we go from here? I don't really, today they were supposed to introduce a bill on the floor by Senator Scutari, who's the guy who's behind the legalization initiative. I think now it's going to happen on Monday. They got to decriminalize it right away. They got to tell the police, stop enforcing cannabis laws, because as of now, it's still illegal. And if you look at the numbers, New Jersey, arrested more people than any other state for cannabis. So it depends on the police force, depends on the local prosecutor, but the Attorney General did say to people, be careful, it's not legal yet. Murphy said the same thing, because some cops are still going to be, exercising what they think is their job, and we'll still see, that disparity between white and blacks incarcerated, should they, but I think we're in a better place than other states because of that legislative process. A lot of things that would have been debated have already been debated. So infrastructure-wise, there are things in place. And once again, having Diana put on the council, leading the council rather, is something that is a crucial element to effectively organizing how they're going to get it done. I think we're going to see Jeff Brown probably take a step back now that there is a commission. He's for the Department of Health and has basically been acting as the chair, but that won't continue, I don't think.
Stu,
yeah.
he is also appointed to the commission. He's the I didn't see. He's the second in command behind Diane. So
I only saw the announcement about Diana.
Yeah, so I think we're going to see some social equity and some innovation coming from Diane, and I think we're going to see a lot of business as usual coming from Jeff Brown.
And I think that's great because Jeff Brown has existing relationships, and he could help be a strong liaison, and Diana as well. And I think, not criticizing Massachusetts again, but their commission as you know, Jimmy, has certainly not been without problems.
Well, somebody who knows.
Can I follow up just on one point that
Sure,
Stu
go ahead,
made?
Ron.
You were talking about the tax rate.
Yeah.
And I do know that it's admirable that New Jersey is trying to cap it at less than 9%. But we have a bigger issue. And our bigger issue is that the price of our cannabis right now is between $400 and $500 for an ounce.
Yeah.
Bruce, I'm sure you're smiling because you're there in Washington. Exactly. And so guess what? The underground market is going nowhere until we can make some sort of inroads in that, either by vastly ramping up our production or getting some sort of imports from other states or perhaps other nations at some point. And then 9% becomes relevant. But you slap 9% on $500, guess what? Underground market says you do that all day long.
Well, ideally, you know, with the passage of the law, we still have the courts tied up the awarding of medical licenses from people who got it in 2018 and 2019. So if we're up to full speed, as we should have been by now, prices would have gone down because of competition. Right now, all the existing dispensaries have to do is open the door, you know, and they could charge whatever they want. We're still relatively cheaper than states like Massachusetts and California. I mean, $60 for an eighth is, you know, kills me, but I'd rather spend it there than, you know, get black market weed, to your earlier point. I like knowing what I'm smoking. And I think New Jersey, by embracing the adult use part of it, recognizes that, A, we can certainly take care of our tax revenue shortages due to the pandemic, but create an enormous amount of jobs, help people's lives, and, you know, slowly eradicate that stigma as people, you know, really realize the world doesn't end that way.
Stu, the one thing that drives me crazy when people talk about the income, the tax money that's going to come in and how that will help balance the budget, it certainly will go in that direction. But until we handle what the police departments are doing with their chunk of the income, which is all the training on visual identification and all the money they spend on all that enforcement, it is such a waste. There is technology out there now that is a breathalyzer that can tell whether somebody is actively high if they're driving.
For real? I mean, has it really been proven accurate?
Yeah, it's Hound Technologies is on their third round of testing. They've partnered with the San Francisco Police Department. They're working with a university in San Francisco. There's also one in Canada too. But all I'm saying is that I think we need to embrace more of that than to hire police to go sniff at a window and look if somebody's stumbling around and to spend. And you cannot believe how much money is spent training each police officer to do that. And that grabs a good chunk of the money that should be going to other things.
But once again, you know, speaking to accuracy, you know, I have an incredibly high tolerance, and, you know, I can smoke for hours and be fully functional, and someone could be immobilized. So I think the issue with the DWI stuff is how they got to recognize my body's tolerance and how it uses it versus, you know, someone who gets really high.
Yeah, that's a little bit similar to alcohol. Certainly we see people who have much bigger tolerances and can still function versus somebody else who takes a sniff of alcohol and can't move. So yeah, I mean, we will have to come up with standards and all that, but I think we can do it. I think technology can eventually get to where we want to go.
Well, and to, you know, there has been some pushback from some of the police departments due to that issue, which is usually their fallback position when fighting legalization in the past or decriminalization in the past. And
Stuart, I want to cut in. I got to go back to Bruce Barcott's reaction
sorry,
to
Bruce.
the price of weed in New Jersey when he heard that. Are you ready to get on a plane, Bruce? Is that what you're pretty much saying?
A plane with a big puffy jacket, and, you know, I'm not saying I'm gonna break any laws, but one thing that is intriguing is that if we have a Biden administration, and let's say we still have Mitch McConnell and gridlock in the Senate, we can't get the MORE Act passed there. You know, there are some interesting things that could be tried with a Department of Justice that has open ears. In other words, we could have some new version of the Cole memo, right? And then we can start floating ideas like potential interstate compacts. You know, this is something that I know, like Steve D'Angelo and some other folks have floated earlier this year with regard to, you know, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, that area. And especially here on the West Coast, I mean, the compact between Washington, Oregon, and California would really help Oregon solve its overproduction problem. I mean, Oregon's still sitting on millions of pounds of extra weed. And that could be something that's really interesting, that it is another, laboratory of democracy in the states that, short of full federal legalization, if that's not possible, that could be a really interesting idea to work with in the next year or two.
Well, if you look at the Northeast, Bruce, that you could go from Washington, D.C. all the way up to Maine.
Yeah.
And I think you're pretty much going through either a medical or an adult use state, all the way up.
And I'd love to sample a product, something from Maine. I'd be really interested in what they're growing up there.
It's really nice. It's really good stuff.
Bruce, I can help you with that. I just want to say, okay.
So I've got a question for Bruce.
Yeah.
Bruce, let's assume that it's no longer illegal at the federal level. Some money comes into the states with the real big companies. Everybody thinks we've got big companies in the cannabis sector. But when you think about it, the 800-pound gorillas in the cannabis sector are really small companies when you look at corporate landscape, right? We had somebody who dropped $4 billion into a cannabis company back in August of 2018 that just set off the fire on valuations. But the party that wrote the check had $100 billion on hand. So when the really big guys come in and start paying the lobbyists, I think the interstate commerce will happen. When interstate commerce takes place, and you can take the oversupply as well as the excess supply currently out of the West Coast and ship it east, what do you think happens to our cultivation industry on the East Coast?
I think you have to figure out how to support yourself as a locally attached brand, or a craft scale brand. I mean, one of the quotes, I think this is happening just on a state level. We had a really nice quote from the CFO of a dispensary in Montana, and they were talking about the change that adult use is going to bring in Montana, and they said, they have probably maybe 5 dispensaries in the state right now, right? That's a big company in Montana. And they said, look, it's the reality in our state right now. We pass adult use. You're going to have to team up, you're going to have to combine forces, or you're going to have to get big or figure out how to get big, because the demand for product is there. You cannot deny the demand for product. And each state, we still have some control, as we do to a certain extent with liquor, in terms of states controlling those rules, state legislatures controlling those rules, state liquor and cannabis boards controlling those rules. Obviously, the state legislature can be swayed by lobbyists and a lot of campaign cash and that sort of thing. But there is still going to be at least some level of state control over that. But you're right. I mean, the farmers who can grow it cheap are going to be sending it to other states where it's really hard to farm. But then again, you don't grow corn in Arizona,
Right.
Well, you just made the point, right? You don't grow corn in Arizona, and I don't think that long term we're going to be growing weed in the Northeast. I think it's going to come from those areas where they can grow it outside way cheaper in the open air than you can do it at $250 a square foot for a cultivation facility.
Yeah. Right. And hang on a second. I've got to take back control here a little bit. First of all, I can listen to you guys talk for hours, but I love to keep this going. We have 3 more guests coming in for the next 30 minutes. Some of them I know all of you know who they are. But I do want to thank Stuart, Bruce, and Rob for really good conversation, enlightening us a little bit about what's going on in New Jersey. And Bruce, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. So please, guys, stay tuned, keep in touch, and we're going to continue with our Cannabis Chat discussion here on election week. Or is it going to be election month? It's been crazy, but we'll have more from Cannabis Chat after this. Don't go away.
We are Pro Cannabis Media.